Hello, everyone. We're back again on another episode of The Fact, the series that discusses international issues every week. Today, we would like to talk about the issue of Syria. And as you know, in these last days, we witnessed the liberation of different parts in Syria, including different sections of the province Idlib in Syria. So we would like to go into more details concerning this, recent success in this war. And we have three respected guests from different countries. We have Vanessa Beeley. She's an independent journalist from France. And also we have Paul Antonopoulos from Brazil. He's also an activist and political commentator. We also have Mark Taliano. He's a writer and political commentator from Canada. I would like to welcome all three of you to the program. It's a true honor to have you on this episode of The Fact. I would like to start with the first question, going to Vanessa, if you may. Actually, we had seen different sections and parts of operations in Syria in order to liberate different parts of this country. If you want to go into more details about the process of the liberation in Idlib, what would you say about that? Because we know that it had different phases, and I would like to know about the stage and phase that actually this operation is going on.
Between Turkey and Russia to establish the deconfliction zones around the borders of Idlib and northern Hama. Now, of course, what we've seen since then is a systematic violation of that deconfliction zone by the terrorist groups that are, of course, backed and armed and financed particularly by Turkey. And we've seen Turkey power multiplying those groups illegally during that entire period that those deconfliction zones were supposed to be maintained and the heavy weapons were supposed to be removed. During that time also, we've seen the targeting of all of the border towns, both in West Aleppo and on the borders with northern Hama and Idlib, particularly the Syrian Christian towns of Al-Skalbiya and Mahade, who have been mercilessly targeted by these terrorist groups that are dominated by Al-Qaeda inside Idlib and northern Hama for the last 8 years. What we've seen now in the last 15 days, and in my opinion, there was a ceasefire around 15 days ago during the Syrian Arab Army operation to effectively cleanse those deconfliction zones of those armed groups, those terrorist groups, to prevent the targeting of civilians in the border towns. So it was a limited military exercise initially. But with the terrorist continued violation of any form of ceasefire or of the deconfliction zone, what we saw was an uptick in the military campaign. And I believe around 15 days ago, there was an agreement reached between Turkey and Russia, with Russia obviously pushing that agreement, that Turkey would effectively withdraw support from Idlib and to some degree withdraw militarily on the basis that it would then be allowed to target another United States proxy in the northeast, the SDF. This agreement has been talked about in various reports, and it has been, I believe there was a question regarding this agreement in Turkish parliament. What we saw then was what I saw was a breakdown in the terrorist ranks. And over the next 15 days, we saw an incredible campaign by the Syrian Arab Army to basically encircle a pocket of northern Hama. So they haven't actually effectively started the full campaign in Idlib yet, or the ground campaign in Idlib yet. What they've done effectively is to liberate all of Hama, so all of northern Hama. And so now they've pushed forward the Syrian Arab Army front lines to the borders with Idlib, and what we're now seeing is intensive aerial bombing of Idlib, of the terrorist encampments and headquarters and ammunition dumps, etc. in Idlib, I believe ready for the push by the Syrian Arab Army into Idlib. And what I think we'll also see is a similar campaign, a similar strategy. What they will do is to encircle pockets of the province to secure them and then move in and cleanse those pockets of the terrorists. What they've also done is to take control of the Aleppo to Damascus highway, or in fact the Turkey to Aleppo to Damascus highway, cutting off the terrorist supply line. So what we've seen is what we always see with the Syrian Arab Army, despite being far less well equipped than the terrorist groups that are equipped, of course, by some of the most powerful nations in the world. We've seen the Syrian Arab Army, with intelligence and strategy, basically overwhelm the terrorist forces in northern Hama and prepare themselves for a further push into Idlib.
All right, thank you, Vanessa. You mentioned Turkey in this whole operation and this whole war that we have in Syria. I would like to ask Paul about the reason that actually Turkey would try to deploy its forces into Syria and into Idlib. Is there any special purpose for Turkey in order to do such a thing, such a military action in Idlib, or not?
Short answer is that this is just a continuation. So the very short answer is that this is just a continuation of Turkey's long goal of regime change. That's a very simple answer, very basic. But if we reflect on the wider conditions of what's exactly is happening in Turkey now, with millions and millions of Syrian refugees, many of them without access to education, healthcare, and jobs, this particular situation is becoming increasingly volatile in Turkey internally, as well as that the lira, the Turkish lira, its currency has just been dropping and dropping, and the economy becoming weaker and weaker. And if we reflect on the recent elections, the municipality elections just earlier this year in Turkey, Erdogan's AKP party suffered greatly from this. They lost in the three major cities of Istanbul, Ankara, and Izmir. So right now their popularity is actually plummeting to some extent in Turkey. So to a limited extent, this operation or their military intervention into Idlib, the deployment of their military is just a way of trying to engage in populism in Turkey. And unfortunately, the country has a susceptibility to populism. It remains to be seen whether that this will eject Erdogan back to the great heights of his popularity that he has been experiencing over the many years. So that's just another aspect to look at of why Turkey is deploying its forces into Idlib. Now, if we go back to the very simple answer that is just a continuation of the regime change operation that it's engaged in since 2011, it becomes even more curious considering that its intervention into Syria has only meant that it allowed the conditions for the Kurdish militias, the YPG, to emerge that formerly never existed in Syria. So this is just an attempt for Erdogan to reboost his popularity, considering that he is the key reason that millions of Syrian refugees are in Turkey. He is the reason, and partly the Syrian intervention is a reason why the Turkish economy has collapsed. And Erdogan, once again, is also the reason why the Kurdish militias have emerged in Syria that previously did not exist. So I would argue that this deployment of forces of Idlib is just is a big popularity boost for Erdogan.
All right, thank you, Paul. Just before we continue, I guess I lost your image, but your voice is just okay. If you can talk actually louder, that would be perfect, but we have your voice. So if you just deactivate your camera and activate it again, it will be fine. If not, try to log out and log in again. That will be solved. All right. Paul perfectly mentioned the regime change, which is basically somehow considered as the purpose of Turkey to enter to Idlib or Syria. But if you want to go into international law aspect of such a intervention, what would you say about that, Vanessa? Do you think this this kind of intervention from Turkey in Syria and in such operations, especially in Idlib that has lots of Al-Nusra groups and Al-Nusra forces, would be conforming to international laws and treaties or not?
The easy answer is no, absolutely not. But, the same could be said about the entire regime change alliance, which of course includes America, the EU, Great Britain, Turkey, the Gulf states, Israel. What we're seeing is an absolutely criminal violation of all international laws and treaties. And of course, this is not unusual for the US coalition. We see them effectively working as rogue states. And I believe it was President Putin, when discussing North Korea, he said, look, without international law, we have global insecurity. And that is effectively what is happening now. It's not only, of course, happening in Syria, it's happening in Venezuela, it's happening globally. But when we're focusing specifically on Turkey, Turkey under Erdogan particularly, of course, has Ottoman Empire pretensions and ambitions. They have effectively been annexing territory in Syria historically, but also during the last 8 years. Not only have they been annexing territory, of course, what we saw in Aleppo when the terrorists that were effectively under the control of Turkey, the Tawhid Brigade, which is the first brigade that entered Aleppo, what they did was to dismantle thousands of factories and basically remove them and then rebuild them in Turkey. And what we're actually seeing now with the remainders of the terrorists in Idlib that we know to be under the control of Nusra Front, even Brett McGurk has said that it's the biggest Al-Qaeda haven since 9/11 in Idlib. What we're seeing again now, since the liberation of Hama, is the dismantlement of factories and refineries, etc., and the taking of those factories and those buildings, those establishments to Turkey, where they're being re-established, and then continuing running as a going concern. So we're not only seeing theft of territory by Turkey, we're seeing industrial theft. We're seeing the support and incubation of the criminal terrorist groups that have effectively invaded Syria for the last 8 years. And now the remainder of those groups are in Idlib under the control of Turkey. We saw a convoy of equipment and weapons that was attempting to reach northern Hama to reinforce the terrorist groups there. It was stopped by the Syrian Arab Army. We have a Turkish military base that is surrounded by the Syrian Arab Army in the formerly terrorist-occupied northern Hama. And of course, the Turks didn't expect the Syrian army to do that. They expected to be able to negotiate their way out of it, and they haven't been able to. So what I think we're seeing now is an international law violation.
All right. It is very interesting that actually Turkey is showing its support toward Al-Nusra groups and terrorists in different operations so far in Syria. For example, recently in liberation operation of Khan-Sheikhoon in Syria, as officials said in Syria, Turkey showed its support and supported such groups officially without having any problem. Although it might be considered as some kind of taboo to actually to show your support toward terrorist groups, but Turkey is doing that. What would you think about such an action? Do you think Turkey would have any benefits in officially showing its support toward terrorist groups or not? Paul, what is your opinion about this?
My initial answer, I answered the current reasons why Turkey is supporting the terrorist groups in Idlib. Now, I want to backtrack on the reasons why Turkey is engaging in this regime change operation, and Vanessa Beeley touched upon this when she highlighted that Turkey has had this neo-Ottoman ambition. And historically, as she already touched upon, they annexed the Syrian province of Hatay, which is in today's Turkey along the Mediterranean coast. And they've effectively annexed large areas of northern Syria. So just continuing on from what Vanessa said, this has always been a long-term goal. However, this long-term goal was disrupted. It was disrupted with the YPG emerging, which was not expected, and them controlling huge swaths of northern Syria. So this was completely not expected. Now, it might sound a little conspiratorial, but as we reflect on history, I would argue that it definitely is not. And we all know that despite the rhetoric, as particularly in the early years of the war, that there's moderate rebels, the Free Syrian Army, etc., etc., it was very, very quickly revealed, especially thanks to colleagues of ours like Vanessa Beeley for revealing that the majority of the so-called rebels have this jihadist ideology. Now, Erdogan is trying to portray himself as some sort of neo-Sultan leader of the neo-Ottoman Empire. Effectively, he's trying to create his own caliphate that one day he hopes he can lead. And he does this through the Muslim Brotherhood and terrorist groups like the Al-Nusra Front. Now, the Al-Nusra Front, as we already know, are the most powerful jihadist group in Syria. So they're the force that can help him project his goals, or Turkey's foreign policy and what it wants. So they're the ones that can achieve this. They're the ones that pose the greatest threat to the Syrian army. They're the ones that pose the greatest threat to the US-backed Kurdish militias, who are also playing a role in preventing the annexation of northern Syria to Turkey. However, we know that this is part of their greater goals for decentralization, federalization, autonomy, independence, according to different factions within the Kurdish militias. So in this way, Erdogan really doesn't have a choice but to support the Al-Nusra Front, as they're the only force capable of being able to challenge the Syrian army.
All right, thank you, Paul. In here, I would like to know if actually both of you covered this question somehow, but I would like to have a better view of the future. Do you think such interventions in different operations in Syria by other countries would eventually end up in a real military conflict between these countries or not? We have the example of Turkey right now, and do you think eventually Syria will have to enter a direct military operation or war or conflict with Turkey or not?
I mean, I think effectively we have had a low intensity, well, a varying intensity conflict between Turkey and Syria since the beginning of the war against Syria in 2011. And I think what we have really been watching inside Syria is a world war to a degree. It's just we're not calling it that. We're not raising the alarms by saying that if Russia and the US are coming very close to a hot war inside Syria at certain times. And of course, we've seen Turkey bring down the Russian warplane. And what we've actually seen is a degree of reticence even by the Syrian government and by Russia to engage in a hot war. And I think that is the pattern that it will take, as much as Turkey will attempt to provoke some kind of conflict. And of course, we have to remember Turkey is still a NATO member. It is still a vassal state of the US coalition. And so therefore, we still have to be very aware that there is a chance that Turkey may well try to provoke some sort of hotter, higher intensity conflict, as of course Israel does as well with the recent bombing in Damascus last night, which we see a familiar pattern, both from Turkey and from Israel, from both ends, of course, to a degree, working with the US coalition to destabilize Syria from three sides, in fact, from the northeast, from the northwest, and from the south, from Israel. And we see again from Israel the aggression last night, immediately after the liberation of northern Hama, and the deadly blows given to their terrorist proxies also in Hama and Idlib. This is a familiar pattern. We see this all the time. But I think we have to take into account the negotiations that are ongoing, the real politics that is being kind of worked at another level between Russia and Turkey. And I think Russia is capable of holding Turkey at bay from a higher intensity war. I hope so.
Vanessa, you pointed out Russia's role in this whole war that we have in Syria, but if you want to focus more on the role of Iran and Russia in different operations, and right now operation of Idlib, what would you say about that? I would like to ask this question from Paul. So we're actually going to another aspect of this, such operations, and that would be the role of Iran and Russia, which are, basically, present in Syria.
Great. So just to address that question, of course, Russia and Iran have always played a critical role from the very beginning of the conflict to various degrees. It wasn't until September 2015 that Russia finally intervened. And just to clarify on what Vanessa was questioning earlier, the Russian jet was downed by Turkey in November 2015. And it's been one big whirlwind since then, and Russia has played an absolute critical role since September 2015 in the survival of the Syrian army and the Syrian state, but not only this aspect, but also to roll back the advances by the anti-government forces. And of course, Iran has played a very crucial role in this. Now, to look at the Iranian involvement in the Idlib operation, I'm not too sure about this, so perhaps Vanessa or Mark will be able to answer this question more succinctly. But on the Russian aspect, they've just continued what they've been doing consistently since September 2015 on an advisory role and playing a critical part with targeted airstrikes against jihadist positions. If we look at the question whether a hot war will emerge between Syria and Turkey, I don't think that this will occur. And the main reason I believe this is that Russia has shown great pragmatism and patience against continuous Turkish offensives and insults and aggression. And, even despite their own jet being downed by the Turkish military, by Turkish-backed terrorists, Russia still showed great restraint. So although Turkey is really, really pushing for a hot war to occur between Syria and Turkey, I don't think it will eventuate, despite Erdogan showing a clear agenda to sacrifice his own soldiers in the town of Morek, who are completely surrounded by government forces at the moment. And Erdogan's so-called defiance that these soldiers will not withdraw from their positions, despite being guaranteed a safe passage out of the town. So at a greater extent, I think Russia does have a crucial role to play in this current offensive, whether it be advisory, whether it be targeted airstrikes, or whether it is to keep Turkey in check and not pushing for a greater war that it so desperately seeks against Syria.
Well, I would like to right now to know your general idea. If you want to add anything, I would like to hear it. So let's start from Vanessa. Would you like to add anything about the subject that we have talked about?
I think what is really important, we're seeing again, an increase in the sensationalist hyperbole from Western media, describing the targeting of hospitals, all the same rhetoric that we heard during the liberation of East Aleppo, the liberation of Eastern Ghouta, Homs. It doesn't matter which area that has been infested by these terrorist hordes under whatever moniker you want to give them. They are all effectively of the same, as Paul said, of the same extremist ideology. I think what we've seen in northern Hama in the last 2 days since the full liberation of this province is what we will effectively be seeing, as we have seen historically in previously liberated areas, is the celebration of the towns that are suddenly released from the threat of missile attacks. Having said that, in Rasif, one of the villages in northern Hama, close to Al-Skelbiya, the Syrian Christian town, was again targeted today by the terrorists in Idlib and caused the martyrdom of a young doctor, Rita Tauba. So clearly the threat is not over. We know that the terrorists left in Idlib have a degree or a high sophistication of weaponry. So the urgency now is for the Syrian Arab Army to work on the impetus of the liberation of northern Hama and to push further and deeper into Idlib and to liberate not only the province itself, but the people from terrorist occupation, those that are being used as human shields, those that are being kept hostage, those that are being, as we saw, the armed groups publicly executing civilians the other day, having extracted a confession from them by torture. So we know that the atrocities committed against Syrian civilians are ongoing in Idlib itself, and that it is paramount importance that the Syrian Arab Army liberate the civilians in Idlib so that Idlib.
And here I would like also to know your additional words to this subject, Paul. What do you say about the whole general operation? And if you want to add anything, I will be more than happy to hear it.
Yes, unfortunately, it's not what we wanted. The military approach by the Syrian Arab Army and its allies is unfortunately the only option that can be taken for the full liberation of Idlib. For years and years and years, there have been different conferences and different congresses and discussions for a peaceful solution to the Syrian war. However, as I have consistently maintained for many, many years now, the only solution to concluding the Syrian war is with a military operation. We got to remember, we're dealing with extreme jihadist groups, Al-Qaeda linked. There's even cells of Daesh in Idlib. There's Aqra al-Sham. There's many, many jihadist groups, many, many terrorist groups, and they've got the radical ideology of martyrdom. Not that martyrdom is a radical ideology in itself, but they have an ideology to fight to the death. They're not interested in a peaceful resolution to the Syrian conflict. Their only resolution is to install a very radical regime, a true regime that will discriminate against all religious minority groups that exist in Syria. This is their openly intended statement. So unfortunately, we have to rely on the various different militias, army personnel, etc., all the different heroes involved in the defense of Syria to bring an end to this conflict. I'm going to emphasize it once more. It is the unfortunate only conclusion to the Syrian war, that it has to be done through military means. And because this is the only way to bring a conclusion to the Syrian war, it unfortunately means that the Syrian army are going to have many more martyrs amongst their ranks, and so will their allies. And on top of that, there is inevitably going to be more civilian casualties. This is a very unfortunate reality of war. There are always civilian casualties, but we have to question the motives of their deaths. And we know that the Syrian army makes all precautions to try their best to avoid any civilian casualties. However, it does make it hard sometimes when the terrorists are hiding amongst the civilians, with the civilian presence not even known. So the Syrian army will unfortunately endure many sacrifices and many martyrs to bring a complete conclusion to this war.
All right, Mark. In here, I would like to know about the purpose of Turkey in involving or interfering with this war and this operation in Syria. And as you know, this Idlib operation made Turkey, or actually they tried to deploy their forces in Syria and in Idlib province. And I would like to know about the purpose of such an intervention by Turkey forces and government into such an operation.
Well, okay, to get the truth to this, we have to simplify it, and the truth is fairly simple. Turkey is a member of NATO. There are cross-cutting alliances, but Turkey is a member of NATO, and NATO and its allies are waging war against Syria. It's a criminal war. They are supreme international war crimes. NATO and its allies, including Turkey, support the terrorists in Syria. I hate to say it, but we should all know this by now. Idlib is the Al-Qaeda hotspot, and so Turkey is supplying the terrorists with weapons and diplomatic cover, and NATO has command and control out of Turkey. So they are committing supreme international war crimes. They have no business being in Syria at all. It's basically, I mean, that's the foundational truth to this.
Okay, and here, if we want to go into more details about this conflict between Turkey forces and also the Syrian Arab army forces, do you think eventually we will witness some kind of direct conflict between these two countries? Because right now they are, I mean, Turkey, they're supporting Al-Nusra terrorist groups in Syria. But it comes the question that if it is possible to witness any kind of direct conflict between Syria and Turkey in future.
I hate to predict the future because I don't know, but I don't know how Syria can tolerate these terrorists murdering its people any longer. I don't know how Syria and its allies can tolerate NATO, including Turkey, violating their sovereignty and their territorial integrity any longer. These are supreme international war crimes that the NATO member states and their allies and Turkey are committing. Their plan is to destroy Syria, to balkanize Syria, to make life unbearable in Syria, and Syria is too good to let that happen, and Syria's allies are too strong to allow that to happen. And I think it's the best for all of us if that does not happen, because Syria represents civilization, the rule of international law, and decency. And the terrorist forces, NATO terrorist forces opposing Syria, have no place in that country.
Being such, acts being the international crimes, and this will make me ask about the conforming of such activities with international treaties and laws. But you covered the question perfectly. But also, in here comes the question of other countries, because we have Russia and Iran, which are active and present in Syria. What do you think the role of these two countries should be in such an operation in Syria?
Okay, again, it's my opinion here, but these terrorists are a direct threat. These Western-supported terrorists, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and the anti-democratic SDF and YPG, PKK, so forth. They're like chameleons. They have different names all the time. That's to confuse everything. But Russia and Iran cannot have these terrorists threatening them every day, all the time. These terrorists have to be dealt with. And so far, against all odds, Syria and its allies have succeeded in dealing with them successfully at a terrible, terrible cost. The cost is horrendous. And that includes all aspects of imperial warfare that are being waged against Syria, including economic war. Children, women, men are being basically murdered every day because of this economic war that the West is waging against Syria and its peoples. And these terrorists have been waging warfare. These are sectarian terrorists. They're Al-Qaeda. They are ISIS. They do not tolerate any ideology that is different from their Wahhabi ideology. They have been targeting Christian communities, Alawite communities. Civilization does not deserve this. We have to take care of this problem, and Syria and Russia and Iran have the I think they have to get the job done. That's my opinion. How can they tolerate these terrorists, these NATO-infiltrated, supported, commanded and controlled terrorists at their borders? Destabilization is what NATO is trying to do. Now, destabilization is a nice word, but what it means is to destroy a country. And they do that with terrorism. They do it with economic warfare. And let's all hope that that doesn't happen, because this chaos is imposing a holocaust against the peoples in the Middle East and beyond. And as a human being, I cannot defend what my government is doing. I cannot stand idly by and allow this to happen without speaking the truth. Because our governments are on the wrong side. Our governments are supporting the terrorists, and that's wrong. And we are committing an overseas holocaust, our governments are, and all of us need to take a stand and say, this is wrong, stop it.
All right, thank you. I would like only to ask you, in case you want to add anything, I would be more than happy to hear it.
Well, I send my best wishes and my prayers to every single Syrian, because I know they've had to withstand years, almost 9 years of Western-supported terrorism, unspeakable terrorism, beheadings, extremism, and even though I stand against my government's position, I stand for the truth, I stand for international law, and I am not standing idly by. I am denouncing my government right now for supporting these terrorists, and I thank God for Syria, and I thank God for Syria's allies, every single one of them, who are helping to protect the Syrian civilization and to protect the stability of the world, because NATO wants to rule through destability. And as human beings, all of us, brothers and sisters, we cannot allow this.
Okay, thank you, everyone. We have come to the end of this episode of The Fact. I would like to thank all three of our guests, Ms. Vanessa Beeley from France, Mr. Paul Antonopoulos from Brazil, and also Mr. Mark Taliano from Canada. It was a great honor to have you on this episode of The Fact. I would like also to tell our listeners and viewers that you can actually follow our news and episodes on the YouTube channel and social networks, and also on the website. Thank you, everyone, and good night.